So I'm going to take about the next 25, 30 minutes and talk to you about a topic that over the last 20, 24 years has gradually gained more attention, especially since I started doing couples counseling. I focused on that since about 18 years ago, focusing on couples counseling. And so during that time, I've learned something very interesting. That's been both a personal and a professional journey for me. And I feel super compelled to talk about it, especially with fellow therapists, because I think it's a really important issue that we all need to raise our attention around. So to start with this, I'm going to ask for some audience participation. I'm going to throw up some words here on the screen. And what I'd like you to do is, this is free association. Does everybody know what free association is? So what I want you to do is yell out at the top of your lungs the words that just naturally occur to you when you see these words on the screen. All right, nice and loud. You ready? Here we go. Nice and loud so I can hear you. Never mind. Keep going. Safety.
Intimacy.
Intimacy. Difficult.
Closeness.
Inside. Perfect. Essential. Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to show you the next slide. Same thing, nice and loud. Words that just automatically come to your mind. You ready? Nice and loud.
Sex.
Oh, everybody says sex. Nice. Okay, what else? Chocolate. Shopping. Soccer. Music. Wine. Yeah. Kitty cats. Lovely. Perfect. Okay, thank you. And once again, nice and loud. Pleasure. Intimacy, connection. Copulated. Complicated. Sex is complicated. Yes. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so did anybody notice anything different about that last word than the first two? There's silence and hesitation, exactly. So sex isn't always the easiest thing for us to talk about. Most of us have some degree of when it comes to talking about sex, depending on the degree of what we're talking about. I mean, most of us in the room can say sex. Can we all say it together on the count of three? 1, 2, 3. Sex! Yeah, and even that word, probably okay. But if we got into words like cock and orgasm and anal penetration and flogging, these might be some words that you might just feel a little bit more tender around. So I want to really be careful. When I was doing this talk, I really wanted to not offend anybody because I'm a pretty sexually liberated person, and I know not everybody is quite a lot like me. But I also wanted to stretch you a little bit, so I hope you can give me just a little bit of liberty to kind of invite you into a bit of a stretch here. So here's the really interesting thing that I discovered, is that when I think about intimacy in my own world, sex is probably the most powerful way that I feel connected with my partner. Certainly talking and sharing intimate conversations and being vulnerable for sure makes me feel connected, but the height of my intimate communion and connection with my partner comes through physicality and sex. And the thing that dawned on me about 10 years ago, so I started working with couples specifically about 18 years ago, and about 10 years ago I noticed that my conversations as a couples therapist, my conversations with couples about sex were at best cursory. And so I noticed this huge gap between what's really important for me in terms of feeling connected, and I'm working with these couples, and I can't imagine it's that much different for them, but there was this huge gap. I just wasn't talking about it. So I went, what's going on here? And the other thing that surprised me is it took me 8 years in couples therapy to realize I wasn't talking about sex. And as I dove a little deeper into the topic, I realized that my personal comfort with sex and talking about sex directly translated into my ability to my professional comfort in talking about sex. So I realized there was a real problem here. So this is what I want to explore with you today: is what are the impacts in our ability when the room falls silent on this topic? Does it fall silent also in your room with your clients? And so what's the impact of that? So why is sex so hard to talk about? Well, the truth is, as much as we have a hard time talking about sex, much of our listening and our looking is done in private. When I started to examine my own and society's beliefs and attitudes and biases and stigmas around sexuality, I realized that there's 3 major reasons why it's so hard for us to talk about sex, and here they are. So the first one is many of us carry some degree of personal sexual trauma and pain. I'll get into some stats later on that are very sobering around this. And so we have our own relationship with pain that influences our capacity to talk about sex. The next thing is sexual ignorance. And I was toying about whether I should use that word ignorance or not, because it's a strong word, but what I really mean there is our education around sexuality, the lack of it and the misinformation that we have about sexuality. And the third piece is that there is a very, very, very long history, powerful history of sexual shame in our culture. So, and I want to start with shame because I think shame is the bed in which sexual ignorance and personal trauma, sexual trauma, emerge from. So, but I'd like to start with a personal story about sexual shame. When I was thinking back, when was the first time I experienced sexual shame? I'm about 12 years old, and I remember I'm downstairs in the hallway of my home, and on the bookshelf, there's this book, Joy of Sex. Has anybody seen this book before? Yeah, perfect, right. So I'm a young boy, and I see this on the shelf, and I'm feeling kind of excited and kind of fearful, and I look around, I grab the book, and I stick it up under my arm, and I rush upstairs into my bedroom. And I kept that book under my bed for a number of weeks for some nighttime reading. And when I opened it up, I saw all these really cool pencil sketches of cocks and pussies and tits and fucking and all sorts of great things. I was like, woo. So, I had that book in my room for a while, and then I remember one morning I was walking down the steps, and I think I remember I was on the 4th step down. And I overheard my dad in the kitchen say to my stepmom, "Trevor has the Joy of Sex book under his bed." And you can imagine what might have happened to me. Every cell in my body contracted. I just went, oh man, I've been caught. And the shame. So I turned around, walked back up the stairs, and went back in my room, and I thought, how the hell am I going to handle this? I've been caught. And then I thought about that story a little bit more, and I realized that not only did I feel bad when I got caught, even before I pulled that book off the shelf, I was like sneaking it away. So I was like, okay, where is this shame coming from? And I imagine that we all have some version of this story in our lives. So what are the origins of shame? Let's talk about that for a bit. So like I said before, we have a very long and powerful history of sexual shame. Shame is steeped in our religion and our culture and in our families. And I'm going to start with religion because religion really informs family values and cultures. All 3 major religions have some versions of messages about sexual shame, but I'm going to focus on Christianity for a moment. If we go right back to the beginning, to the creation story, when Adam and Eve are in this lovely, the Garden of Eden. And I'm going to quote from the Bible here. And by the way, this is the most cited section of the Bible, is the creation story, Genesis story. And it says, both were naked and were not ashamed. Then, of course, they eat this tree that they're not supposed to be eating. And then what happens next is the eyes of both were opened and they knew they were naked. It's the first thing that they noticed. But they remedied this very quickly. pulled together some fig leaves, sewed them together, and covered up what? Loud? Their genitals. They didn't cover their nose or their toes or their eyes. They covered their genitals. And so what message does that give us, right? And Christianity is also a religion that's centered upon a figure whose holiness begins with having been conceived asexually. Right? So historically, religion has treated sex as essentially a necessary evil in order to propagate the human species, basically. Pleasure was sinful. Enjoying yourself was sinful. Essentially, sex was regarded as an obstacle to holiness. Now I'd like to turn to culture for a moment. So, of course, religion informs culture. In the 1800s, during the Victorian era, you probably know this, that they had a very frigid relationship with sexuality. Quite misinformed, quite frigid. And I'm going to read a quote from the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal. This is in 1850, where they declared that masturbation is public enemy number one. Neither plague, nor war, nor smallpox, nor a crowd of similar evils have resulted more disastrously for humanity than the habit of masturbation. It is the destroying element of civilized society. Right? So these are some very powerful messages about sexuality and how it's not okay. Now, our attempts to try to control our sexuality were many. This is called an anti-masturbation belt. Anti-masturbation belts were used in North America right up until 1930s. That doesn't include things like genital mutilation, chastity belts, and even this. Many of you may not know this. Has anybody had this for breakfast ever? Put your hand up. Have you ever had cornflakes before? Perfect. So cornflakes was developed by Dr. Kellogg. And Dr. Kellogg was a leading sex educator of his time, and this is around the early 1900s. And he formulated cornflakes specifically to suppress libido. And it was only 100 years ago, only 100 years ago, that most men and doctors, most of whom were men, believed that women didn't even have sexual desire or libido. They were simply vessels. So it's not that long ago, and it wasn't until 1973 that homosexuality was finally, all evidence of it was finally removed from the DSM in terms of it being a disorder. So this stuff has been around us for a long time. And then there's our families.
How are cornflakes?
You'll have to look that up. I'm sorry, I don't know the actual formulation. I don't know. But it's clear that it was formulated for that specific reason. There was a huge anti-masturbation campaign around that time. And actually, Dr. Kellogg proudly claimed that in the 4 decades of his marriage, he hadn't had sex once. That was a proud claim. Proud claim. So I'm going to move on to our family. This is the other place where shame is really brought up. But actually, there's a huge variability in our family. Some of us might have had parents who walked around naked and talked openly about sexuality. And there are other families where parents would be willing to kill their offspring when they find out that their child has been sexually promiscuous. In fact, when I was a youth worker 25 years ago, I remember working with one young woman, 17-year-old woman, who was there because she narrowly escaped an honor killing by her father after she had been caught naked with a boy. So these are the main sources that I think shame comes from. And so these shaming messages we've received, as I say, have been really powerful and long-standing. And so it's inevitable that they form the attitudes of our culture around sex. So now the second reason why it's hard to talk about sex is sexual ignorance or lack of education. And it makes sense to me that shame translates into ignorance because it's really hard to get educated on something we can't talk about or are uncomfortable to talk about. Sex education for kids these days still is pretty limited in terms of its scope. We're talking about STIs and contraception and basic anatomy, but that's about it. And the study of sexuality is restricted mostly to pathology, the way things can go wrong with sex. Sex-positive studies, on the other hand, are routinely discouraged and underfunded. This is a quote from Reverend Peter Sprigg in early 2000s, the director of marriage and family studies for the Family Research Council, a powerful conservative lobbying group based in Washington. And he says, "We know the formula for sexual health, which is sex within a monogamous lifelong relationship. Studying permutations of it, we think, is an effort like Kinsey's to change the sexual mores of the society so that what most people consider deviant behaviors look more normal." And in 2012, the Tennessee state government passed the Gateway Sexuality Activity Bill, which prohibits students from learning about hand-holding and kissing. And teachers can be fined up to $5,000 for doing so. So education, where do we turn to learn about pleasure? Where do we learn about eroticism and sexual identity and fantasy and how to become multi-orgasmic and how to become a kissing aficionado? Where do we turn for all that? There's some pretty limited places to go. Mostly, for a lot of men, it's porn. And for a lot of women, it's romantic comedies and romantic novels. And these are not good examples. They are inaccurate and incomplete models of sexuality. Now, the third reason it's hard to talk about sex is our own personal trauma that we carry. I'm going to show you some very sobering stats. These are North American stats on sexual violence. 1 in 4 women will be sexually assaulted during their lifetime. 1 in 33 men will be sexually assaulted in their lifetime. 80% of sexual assailants are friends or family of the victim. And 17% of girls under 16 have experienced some form of incest. So you can do the math. Even in this room right now, many of us have been affected by this. And I know this is a very tender topic, and I even wondered whether I should talk about it, but I want us to realize that there is a consequence of our poor relationship with sexuality and our inability to talk about it. So with all the shame and ignorance and trauma, it's no wonder it's hard for us to talk about sex. Now, sex is a very powerful drive. Second only to our survival instinct, although some people will risk their lives for sex, it is both the creator of life and the destroyer sometimes of families in the wake of infidelity. It overrides some of our most powerful sensibilities. I have had every second couple that comes into me, 50% of my clients come in to me about infidelity. And I have man after man, usually after man, and a few women, pulling out their hair, or what they have left of it, asking themselves this question: why did I do this? Why did I risk my family? Why did I risk my career? Why did I risk my partnership just for a one-night stand? It's very, very powerful. It's a formidable and a tenacious force. And despite our attempts to, like the anti-masturbation belt, we've done a lot to try to suppress it, but it seems to just keep happening anyways. We're not quite sure actually how to handle our sexuality because it's strong, and so we fear it and we suppress it. Now you might say to me, what are you going on about, Trevor? We're a pretty sexually liberated culture, right? After all, we had the 1960s sexual revolution, free love, and if you just look around our world these days, it's not that hard to find content. Movies, advertisements, we got strip clubs. It's actually legal for women in BC to walk around topless, but I don't see anybody here topless today, at least ostensibly. So I would say that yes, we have come some way in terms of our liberation sexually, but I contend that we're not as far along as we may think. And this next point is really critical to understand. There's a saying that says the fish will be the last one to realize it's in water. When we grow up surrounded by something, we're much less likely to notice it. It's just actually normal. Even in our family systems, people who know family system, it's hard for us to see what might be a little off in our family systems until somebody else tells us that or we witness that. But normal isn't always healthy. Many of our irrational ideals are so deeply entrenched in our culture that it's hard to see them as nonsensical. For example, the sight of adult nudity is inherently harmful to children. A lot of us hold this belief, but actually there is no empirical evidence whatsoever to suggest that that's true. And in fact, in many cultures where nudity is the norm, there ain't no problem. But we still think it's true. Now, this is where sexual suppression becomes sexual repression. We move from conscious avoidance or active stuffing down our sexuality to unconscious avoidance. We think we have a good relationship with our sexuality, or we may not, but shame has become normalized, so we don't even notice it. So our avoidance of sex remains largely unnoticed until someone starts talking about sex around the table. What do you notice happens for you? Or when your child comes up to you and says, "Mummy, what is a blowjob?" Or when I put this word up on the screen and this silence fell across the room. Or when your client says to you, "I like it when he chokes me when we're having sex. Is that bad?" Or when we see pictures like this, and what happens to your body when you see that. This is actually just, I hope that at least some of you do this at home or get a chance to do this. But yeah, when it goes up on a screen, especially at a public event like this, we go, "Oh, is that appropriate?" And I even wondered whether I should put that one up. I had some more softer ones, but I thought, no, I kind of want to make my point. Nothing bad's happening here, folks. It's actually, they're both enjoying themselves very much.
Yeah, I wish I could do the split one.
So after thousands of years of sex-negative conditioning, it's no wonder we don't see the forest for the trees. It's no wonder that sexual shame and repression continues to exert a serious negative consequence on us, both personally, professionally, and in our society as a whole. So what are the consequences of sexual shame and repression? Well, there's two big ones. The first one I call sex going sideways. As I mentioned before, sex is a formidable and tenacious force, despite our attempts to suppress it. And what it does is it kind of squirts out sideways in very harmful ways. You see, we've been given a very, very, very small box for a very, very, very large drive, powerful drive. And when a powerful drive like sexuality is thwarted, it tends to do two things. One is it gets stronger, and two is it's expressed in more perverted ways, i.e. sex goes sideways. Monogamy is one such small box. Many of us have a hard time staying in that box. In fact, most of us, by the time we reach our mid-40s, will have broke open that box. Half of us will have. As I said to you before, half of my clients that come into me are dealing with some kind of form of infidelity. So this is a clear example of where we need a bigger box, but it's hard to talk about. When my couples come in and I say, "Well, do you think that's too small of a box for you to be have sexual fidelity with each other?" It's a tricky topic. So here's just a few other ways that sex goes sideways. I had a very long list, and the feedback I got on the talk was you need to cut that down to a quarter because there's a lot of things. So here's just a few of them. Sex going sideways, sexual abuse, date rape, a $32 billion annual sex trafficking industry, porn addiction, closet masturbators, sexual harassment, sexual objectification, and incest, just to name a few. and all leaving a massive wake of trauma and pain, disconnection, insecurity. Leaves a lot of trauma. Now, the second consequence of sexual shame and repression is that when we don't have a healthy relationship with our sex, we forfeit a number of health benefits that are associated with sex. All the good things. Here's just a few of them. Again, reduce this list considerably. Better blood pressure, so lower blood pressure. Less stress, better self-esteem, better sleep, improve your heart health, boost your immune system, help relieve pain, make you thinner, increase your happiness, reduce prostate cancer, improves intimacy, and this list goes long. And it reduces headaches. So the next time your partner says to you, "Oh, honey, I've got a headache," you know exactly what to do. But for this context, I want to focus specifically on the emotional and the relational benefits, because we're all counselors, and we deal with people, and we deal with relationships. Sue Johnson, who is the founder of Emotionally Focused Therapy, says that most of couples' issues are rooted in disconnection. And this certainly matches my experience in working with couples. The classic complaint that I get about disconnection from my clients is that the woman says, "He won't talk to me," and he says, "She won't have sex with me." So if disconnection is at the root, our job as therapists is to help these people connect. Whether you do, I want to say this too, whether you're doing couples therapy or individual therapy, it doesn't really matter. Sexuality is such an integral part of who we are. We all need to be talking about this more. But if that's the source of it, disconnection, our job then is to help them connect. Esther Perel wrote a book called Mating in Captivity. I don't know if any of you were at her talk last night. Woo, yeah, it was awesome. The State of Affairs, she's got a new book. You should really go get it. She identifies that there are two primary languages of connection. The first one is one we all know about, which is talk or communication. We all know that staying connected happens with open, honest, vulnerable conversations that we have with whoever it happens to be. In our intimate connections, and all of us, I'm pretty sure none of us have a hard time talking about communication. It's probably something we've studied quite a bit about, right? So we're very versant in that area. But the other language of connection is touch or sex. Long before we learned language as children, and long before we learned language as a species, touch was our language of connection. In no other activity is our skin so totally involved than in sex. So you might say that sex is the highest form of touch. And like I was saying earlier, the way I felt most connected in my partnership was through that intimate sexual union. And of course, attachment theory speaks about this clearly. I'm not going to go into it. Most of us know about that. We know that babies fail to thrive and sometimes even die when they don't get touched. And Esther Perel aptly identifies that the dominance of talk intimacy actually reflects a feminization of intimacy. Because some of you may know that the language capacities of the feminine are a little bit more developed than for the masculine. But what that does is it leaves behind the masculine language of connection, which is touch. Now, I'm not saying men and women. Please hear me on that. We all have masculine, feminine in each of us, and depending on what our sexual essence is, we'll respond to these languages more, to either the touch or the talk. Now, the other piece is that there are some really powerful bonding chemicals that get released when we have sex. And here are just a few of them. Oxytocin, otherwise known as the love hormone, that promotes generosity and trust, and it actually increases our positive evaluation of each other. So those of you in relationship, sometimes, well, I know from my couples, it's like, we could really use some of that. I need you to more positively evaluate your partner because sometimes there's nothing left, even though there's lots of good stuff happening. Serotonin induces calmness and satisfaction. Dopamine is a mood elevator, and there's a host of endorphins that are all feel-good chemicals that pour out of our system when we're making love and having orgasms. So it's a really important piece of connection. So if connection is key and there are these two primary languages or arteries of connection, and we're not talking about one of them, you can begin to see what the problem is here. So what's happening in our clients' sex lives? Now here's a preface on these stats. It's hard to collect stats about sexual behavior. Does anybody want to take a guess as to why?
Liars.
Lies? Yeah, it's just hard to talk about. But here's a few. 93% of us agree on the importance of a good sex life, but more than half of us are dissatisfied with our sex lives. Almost 2/3 of us feel we don't have sex often enough. And almost 40% of us feel like sex ends too quickly. 1% of us feels like sex takes too long. Just kidding. 50% of women admit to having faked orgasm, and a full 20% of couples endure a sexless marriage, which is defined as sex 10 times or less per year. Our clients' sex lives fail so often because we have an inability to talk about it with each other. We're afraid to talk about our desires, our preferences, what our fantasies might be, because we fear judgment, we fear we're going to hurt the other person's feelings, or they might just get really upset if we told them that. So while sex is really meant to be a bridge of connection, it all too often ends up a barrier to connection. So indeed, our clients are desperately in a need to have a place to talk about their sexuality. And so this is where we come in. Because sexuality is such an integral part of our everyday existence, we have an ethical imperative, at least I believe, to create a safe place, a welcoming place, environment where our clients can talk about sex. We need to give them permission to talk about sex. Because when we don't do that, we're essentially perpetuating the cycle of shame. Our personal comfort will dictate our professional comfort, and that will dictate our clients' comfort in talking to us about sexuality. So anyone that's doing counseling needs to have some modicum of comfort in talking about their sexuality, especially if you're doing relationship or couples therapy. Like I say, with that one hand behind your back, it's a much more difficult job. And this is not exclusive to sex therapists. How many sex therapists are in the room? Identify as? Okay, nobody. Okay, this is not just for sex therapists. This is for couples therapists and individual. I said this point earlier. It's such an integral part of who we are. Everyone needs to at least have some kind of routine check in their conversation around their assessment about, so what's going on in your sex life? Of course, you need to know your limits and refer out. We're not all experts in sexuality. I'm not an expert in sexuality. I'm starting to get there, but there's lots I don't know. So when I started to talk about sex with my clients, guess what? They started talking to me. It was like this floodgates. It just kind of boosh, but not quite boosh. It was kind of like, you know? They were really happy that we could talk about it, except they were anxious about it, and understandably so, just like we are. So here's my invitation, because I want to get this across that I'm a companion in this journey with you. We're all on the same journey of emancipating from sexual shame. So here's my invitation, is that we work really hard to remove the blocks that we have about talking about sex at all in our personal lives and certainly with our clients. That when you reflect on that free association exercise we did at the beginning when sex came up on the board, that essentially is a barometer to show you kind of how comfortable you are talking about this. Collectively, it's a difficult topic, and individually, it's a difficult topic. I invite you to examine your beliefs and your attitudes and your unconscious biases and the stigmas that you might hold. Because if we don't open this door for our clients around sexual intimacy, we're going to leave them in the closet. So what's the remedy? Since shame seems to be at the heart of this issue, and since shame likes to hide out, the remedy for this is gentle exposure. What we need to do is find our edge and then lean just beyond it. I don't expect you or recommend at all that you dive deeply into these matters. I suggest you go really slow because it's full of pain and trauma and all sorts of things. It's a very interesting journey, I gotta tell you. We need to expand our sexual intelligence. We need to talk about sex. I encourage you to talk to your friends, talk to your partners, talk to your colleagues. Have conversations about sex. Use words like cunt and pussy and fucking and anal penetration and flogging and like whatever it is so that you can feel more comfortable when your client says things like, I like it when my partner chokes me. Is there something wrong with that? Because when your face goes, that's going to be a problem. There's tons of resources out there. This is just a few. I just threw up a bit. There's conferences, there's courses, there are people that you can consult. There are a number of sex therapists in the Vancouver area that you can consult with. There's tons of books. There's the internet. Get educated. And heck, you can come to my presentation right after lunch, and I'm going to show you how to find what your edge is and learn how to talk with clients a little easier. So I want to... The results for me in terms of this journey have been very, very rewarding, both personally and professionally. Personally, I used to be the guy that, I'd walk into like Flight Center. Does anybody know what hedonism is? Yeah, it's a swinger, clothing optional resort down in Jamaica. And I remember going into Flight Center and I would see the brochure for hedonism on the shelf there. And I would walk over and I would notice it, just like I noticed the Joy of Sex book. And I would stand in front of the, that other one called Couples? It's another resort. But I'd be kind of looking at the hedonism, kind of wondering kind of what's going on over there. But I am so much more sexually liberated now. I don't have a hard time talking about any of this. And it's really wonderful because that's translated into a whole bunch of wonderful things. Like I have a very, very deep, intimate sexual relationship with my partner. It's really wonderful. In fact, I'm 49 now, and I am having some of the best sex of my entire life. My libido is at an all-time high. That has to do with a lot of different things. Woo! Sex over 50, everybody. And a lot of my fantasies have become realities. I'm able to talk about these things with my partner. And we're explorers, we're pioneers. And so this big drive that we have, we're making the box bigger. And professionally, I'm now able to provide a safe and welcoming place for my clients to talk about this very, very taboo topic and help them reclaim this integral, beautiful part of who we are. So I'd like to conclude with this. I have a dream. I have a dream that one day we'll be able to talk about sex as easily as we talk about the weather. I have a dream that all of the tragedies in the wake of our unhealthy relationship with sexuality are gone. I have a dream that we have a bigger box for our very powerful and beautiful spectrum of sexuality to show up in. I have a dream that as therapists, we can not only work with the one hand of touch and communication, but we can work with the other hand of touch and sexuality, such an integral part of connection. And I have a dream that 12-year-old boy, instead of being shameful about pulling that book off the shelf, is instead curious and innocent and excited, pulls that book off the shelf and runs excitedly to his parents, opens up the books and says, "What's that?" And they're accepted and not judged and loved and supported in that exploration. Because after all, the book that I pulled off the shelf is called The joy of sex. All right, so that's it. Thanks everybody for your time and attention.